Picture this. In 1900, about 63% of American men over 65 were still working, not because they loved their jobs, but because retirement as we know it barely existed. If you lived long enough to see your hair turn grey, you most likely kept working until you dropped dead at your plough, your workbench, or your factory station. The idea that you could simply stop working and live off savings for decades, that was as foreign as flying to the moon. We take retirement so for granted that we plan our entire financial lives around it. We obsess over 401ks, calculate how much we need to save, debate whether we can retire at 65 or need to work until 67. But this entire concept, the idea that there's a distinct phase of life where you stop working and society supports you, only became widespread in the past century or so. For the vast majority of human history, you worked until you physically couldn't, and then you hoped your family would take care of you before you died. Today, we're going to trace how retirement went from rare to inevitable, and why understanding this history reveals something profound about what we consider a natural part of life versus what we've simply gotten used to. Because the story of retirement isn't just about pensions and social security, it's about how dramatically our relationship with work, aging, and death itself has transformed. Let's start with a number that will completely reshape how you think about the past. In 1900, global life expectancy was around 31 years, not because people routinely died at 31, but because so many died as infants and children that the average got dragged down. Even if you made it to adulthood though, your working life looked nothing like ours. Most people worked until they were physically unable to continue. Retirement periods were typically very brief, often just a few years before death. Today, retirement could easily last 1/3 of your life. But here's what's fascinating. The very first retirement system wasn't born from compassion for the elderly, it was born from fear of rebellion. In 13 BC, Roman Emperor Augustus created a retirement bonus system for legionnaires who'd served 25 years in the military. These weren't kindly old soldiers being rewarded for their service. These were battle-hardened warriors who knew how to overthrow governments, and Augustus was terrified they might use those skills against him. So he bought their loyalty with the world's first government retirement benefit, financed by taxes and designed to keep former soldiers from becoming future revolutionaries. This military model would echo through history. Pensions were tools of political control, not humanitarian gestures. When other rulers granted pensions to victorious armies, they weren't celebrating their veterans, they were preventing military coups for everyone else. The concept of stopping work was simply impossible to imagine. In ancient Greece and Rome, people routinely worked into their 60s and 70s, not because they were workaholics, but because the alternative was starvation. There was no social security, no Medicare, no retirement accounts. If you couldn't work, you depended on your family's charity or you died. Medieval Europe developed a slightly different approach, but only for the wealthy. Rich landowners might grant loyal servants a pension, really just continued room and board in exchange for decades of service. But this was a privilege reserved for the upper classes and their favored retainers. The vast majority of people were peasants who farmed until they physically collapsed. Even the language reveals how uncommon retirement was. The word pension comes from the Latin pensio, meaning payment or weighing out, but originally it referred to any regular payment, rent, wages, or tribute. The idea that it specifically meant payment to people who'd stopped working permanently didn't emerge until much later. Here's a detail that illuminates just how different the past was. In medieval times, reaching old age actually made you more valuable, not less. Elderly people were living libraries in a world without books, newspapers, or Google. They remembered prices from decades past, knew which crops grew best in difficult years, could settle disputes about property boundaries. The phrase elder statesman wasn't metaphorical. Old people literally governed because their memories contained irreplaceable information. But then something revolutionary happened that would eventually create retirement, the Industrial Revolution. And paradoxically, it started by making life worse for the elderly, not better. Before factories, most people worked on family farms or in small workshops where age brought wisdom and flexibility. You could adjust your tasks as your body aged. Maybe you couldn't plow anymore, but you could mend tools or watch children. The Industrial Revolution changed everything by moving work into factories with rigid schedules and physically demanding jobs that required speed and stamina. Suddenly, aging workers weren't wise elders adapting their roles, they were liabilities slowing down production lines. Factory owners began to see older workers as problems to be solved rather than resources to be valued. This created the first real pressure for some kind of systematic way to move older people out of the workforce. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany in 1889. But Bismarck wasn't motivated by concern for elderly workers. He was terrified of young Marxist revolutionaries who were gaining power by promising to overthrow the capitalist system. His solution was brilliant and cynical: create a state pension system that would make workers dependent on the government instead of revolutionary on the streets. Bismarck initially set the retirement age at 70. In 1889, Germany, life expectancy was around 45. Bismarck was essentially promising benefits to people who were statistically unlikely to live long enough to collect them. It was a political masterstroke that cost almost nothing but diffused revolutionary pressure. But here's the crucial detail. Germany later lowered the retirement age to 65 in 1916, and this number would become influential worldwide, not because of any scientific study of human aging, but because of German political and economic calculations. When America created Social Security in 1935, we adopted this same age. The retirement age that shapes millions of lives today was chosen by German politicians trying to balance political pressure with fiscal reality. The American story reveals how retirement evolved from political tool to social expectation. The first private pension in America was created in 1875 by American Express, not for humanitarian reasons, but because the company wanted to get rid of older workers who were seen as less efficient. Early pensions were essentially bribes to convince people to quit. The real transformation began during World War II, and it happened almost by accident. The government froze wages to control wartime inflation, but companies could still compete for workers by offering benefits like pensions. Suddenly, retirement benefits became a standard part of employment packages, not because society decided elderly people deserve support, but because of wartime economic controls. This created something unprecedented in human history: the expectation that ordinary working people could stop working before they died and maintain their standard of living. By 1950, nearly half of American workers had access to employer pensions. The generation that fought World War II became the first in human history to widely experience retirement as we know it. But even then, retirement was brief. Remember, life expectancy in 1950 was only about 68 years. People retired at 65 and typically died within a few years. The long, active retirement we now consider normal, potentially lasting 20 or 30 years, simply didn't exist. This brings us to the most profound shift of all. Retirement stopped being about inability to work and became about the right not to work. This transformation reveals something fundamental about how we understand human value and social obligation. For most of history, people worked until they physically couldn't. The transition from work to non-work was determined by biology. You kept going until your body gave out. But modern retirement flipped this completely. Now we decide in advance when we'll stop working, regardless of our physical capacity. A healthy 65-year-old with decades of potential productivity chooses to exit the workforce because we've collectively agreed that reaching a certain age earns you the right to leisure. This represents a revolutionary change in how societies allocate resources and define human worth. We're essentially saying that people who've contributed to society for several decades have earned a right to consume without producing for the remainder of their lives. No previous civilization could afford this arrangement, and many current societies still can't. The numbers are staggering. In 1880, men's labor force participation rate at age 65 was 78%. Today, it's 19%. We've essentially created a new life stage that didn't exist for our great-grandparents, and we've done it so thoroughly that we now consider working past 65 to be unusual, even though people are healthier and living longer than ever before. But this transformation created new problems that revealed the tensions in our system. The same medical advances that made long retirements possible also made them expensive. When Social Security was created, most people died within a few years of becoming eligible. Now people routinely collect benefits for longer than they worked. The system designed to support a few elderly people for a short time now supports millions for decades. The generational implications are profound. For the first time in history, we have multiple generations of adults who don't work simultaneously. A family might include working parents supporting both their children and their retired parents, while also saving for their own eventual retirement. This creates economic pressures that no previous society faced. Even our language has evolved to reflect this new reality. We now speak of early retirement, phased retirement, and working retirement, concepts that would have been meaningless to our ancestors. We've created an entire industry around retirement planning with financial advisors, retirement communities, and age-specific marketing. We have essentially built a parallel economy designed to serve people who don't work. The psychological impact may be even more significant. For most of human history, identity was tied to work until death. You were a farmer, a blacksmith, a merchant until you couldn't be anymore. Now we expect people to construct new identities as retirees, to find meaning and purpose outside of productive work. This is a historically unprecedented psychological challenge that we're still learning to navigate. What strikes me most about this history is how recently we invented something we now consider inevitable. Your great-great-grandfather almost certainly worked until he died. Your great-grandfather might have had a brief retirement. Your grandfather probably experienced the first generation of lengthy retirements. And now, we're grappling with retirements that could last longer than entire medieval lifespans. We've created something genuinely new in human experience, the expectation that healthy, capable adults will spend decades neither working nor raising children, supported by the labor of others. It's a remarkable achievement of prosperity and social organization, but it's also a fragile arrangement that depends on economic growth, demographic balance, and social consensus that could shift. Understanding that retirement is invented, not inevitable, doesn't diminish its value, but it does remind us that the choices we've made about aging, work, and social support aren't natural laws. They're collective decisions that we can examine, question, and potentially change as we face new challenges. The history of retirement is still being written, and we're all part of that story.